Alright, so I finally got my hands on a Devourer's Guard, a new legendary Tier 95 Necromancy Mainhand Weapon dropped by Amascut the Devourer. Today I want to test it out and put it through the ringer against the Omni Guard to get an overall feel on where this weapon stands in the current Necromancy meta. We'll try it out at a bunch of bosses where Necromancy is a very popular option. We'll do an apples to apples damage comparison and evaluate the weapon from the perspective of a solo-oriented player versus a group-oriented player. I'll also have the relevant timestamps in the description, so feel free to skip around, and without further ado, let's get right into it. Let's start by looking at the weapon itself, the passive effect and the special attack. This is a Tier 95 Mainhand weapon with identical stats to the Omni Guard most people are already familiar with that comes from Rasial. Just like the Omni Guard, this weapon can also be upgraded to Tier 100 stats by using a Shard of Genesis Essence. But where it differs from the Omni Guard is in the passive and the special effects. At a fundamental level, Necromancy is a combat style that's revolved around using conjures, building stacks, and spending said stacks for big damage. Those stacks are almost like a little currency that you save up and then spend for a big reward. And the two different types of currency that we use are called Necrosis and Souls. So just looking from a basic ability context, Necrosis stacks are slower to build up and can be spent on instantly powerful blows like Finger of Death and empowering the Death Guard special attack. Even spending just a few Necrosis stacks at a time is an easy way to front load some really strong damage with Necromancy. Soul stacks, on the other hand, are faster to build up and can be spent on attacks that at face value are less devastating upfront, but they have some more tactical advantages rather than just front-loaded damage on one target. You'll spend your soul stacks on the stunning ability, Soul Strike, and the multi-hitting ability, Volley of Souls. Oftentimes, unless you're killing bosses like Telos, where stunning is mechanically important, using soul stacks on your basic stun will be a waste of a stack that offers low damage in return. Similarly, using soul stacks too early for your volley and throwing out something like a 2-stack volley rather than a 5-stack volley may be an ineffective strategy. Soul stacks generally build up quickly, but you often want to save them for deliberate tactical uses or backload your spending of them with something like a big 5-stack volley. Up until this point, we had two reliable ways of building Necrosis stacks and only one reliable way of building soul stacks. I'm not including the Occultists and Zorgoth's ring in these, as these rings are a random way of building stacks that are not perfectly reliable. The same caveat goes for Spectral Scythe. So up until this point, you could build Necrosis stacks with every 8th ability with your Touch of Death, or every single auto attack while under the effects of your Living Death ultimate ability. Whereas, you can build soul stacks every 3rd ability with Soul Sap, your one and only reliable source. That is, up until today with the introduction of the Devourer's Guard. Now, thanks to the passive effect of this weapon, we have a secondary source of reliably building up more soul stacks, and can generate soul stacks passively just by using our basic auto attack ability. That does also mean that when we go to use our Living Death, our auto attack will be able to generate Necrosis stacks and soul stacks simultaneously. It's not at a 1-to-1 ratio, of course, but we'll get into some of those nuances momentarily. For now, just know that much like the Omni Guard, as you continue to use your auto attacks, you'll work up to an empowered auto attack. With the Omni Guard, that empowered auto attack is called a Death Spark, and it would do double the damage of your normal auto attack. With the Devourer's Guard, that empowered auto is called Soul Reave. Soul Reave is going to be ready one ability faster than with the Omni Guard, so on your 4th ability, and instead of doing double damage, it's going to do the same amount of damage as your other auto attacks, but it's also going to generate one soul stack passively. One interesting characteristic of the Soul Reave auto is that it does work with Threads of Fate as far as generating souls goes. So when considering Threads of Fate, Soul Reave is functionally like having a second Soul Sap ability. It's hard to think where that's any more useful than just using Soul Sap, but that's an interesting quirk. So not only do we get a way of passively generating more soul stacks, the weapon's special attack also gives us an active way of generating them too, as well as an incentive to spending them earlier. The special attack here is called Soul Crush. It's kind of an interesting blend of the two Necromancy special attacks that we're already familiar with. It takes some mechanics from both of those original weapons and puts an interesting Souls-flavored twist to it. So the special attack on its own will obviously do damage on its initial hit, but honestly it's not that much damage. Just on its own, it's going to do about a third of the damage of an Omni Guard or a Death Guard special attack. However, much like the Death Guard special attack, we can increase the damage that it does by casting the special attack while already having a number of stacks built up. So I'm sure you're familiar by now that when you have some necrosis stacks, your Death Guard is going to do a lot more damage, very often hitting 30,000 and consuming all of those necrosis stacks in the process. This is a very similar mechanic here. By having extra soul stacks, your Devourer guard will do much more damage. Having at least 3 soul stacks seems to be the sweet spot before using this special attack. With 3 soul stacks, it's going to do similar damage to the other 2 weapon specs that you're already familiar with. With 5 stacks saved up, I'm almost always going to be hitting a 30,000 with the Devourer spec. Now an initial big hit is great and all, but that's not too interesting on its own, and that's not where the story ends here either. And here's where the similarity with the Omni Guard comes in. So after the special attack is cast, you'll do your initial damage, and with that, you'll instantly gain the empowered auto attack that we talked about earlier, Soul Reeve. So right away you can cast that empowered auto attack and gain another soul stack right back. From there, and for the next 30 seconds, anytime that you use a souls related ability, you'll instantly regain the empowered auto attack Soul Reeve once again. So you can get yourself into a little loop for 30 seconds of doing a Soul Reeve, then a soul ability. So empowered auto, soul ability, empowered auto, soul ability. Mechanically, that's really similar to the Omni Guard, where you'll get yourself into a rhythm of doing an empowered auto necrosis ability in order to then get another empowered auto. So I think you can see how this Devourer's Guard takes some mechanics from both of the other necromancy specs and applies that soulsy twist. So now I think we have a good grasp on the conceptual design of this weapon, so let's start putting it to use and get testing in live PvM scenarios. I will have timestamps for some of the different bosses in group and solo scenarios, but for starters, I want to get some kind of DPM comparison and a baseline metric between the Omni Guard and the Devourer's Guard. Previously, I've done some dummy, challenge gem, or dwarven barrel tests, but people have tended to be pretty critical of that approach. Maybe I haven't done those tests justice in the past myself. It's true that it's not a perfect way to test weapons, so today I want to try a different baseline test, but with the same spirit. I'm going to go to an actual boss that should serve well as a DPS dummy. It doesn't have a lot of mechanics, but it has a sizable enough HP pool to get a very rough baseline DPM number for both weapons. I'm going to go to hard mode Vindicta. That has 600,000 HP. I'll do 30 kills with the Omni Guard and then 30 kills with the Devourer's Guard. Within those 30 kills, I'll do 10 of them with an Occultist ring, 10 of them with a Zorgoth's ring, and 10 of them with a Reaver's ring. I'll keep my pre-builds exactly the same and start every kill with 0 stacks of any kind and just 100% adrenaline. I'll use the Equilibrium Aura and a Ripper Demon with the 2 Necromancy specific rings, and then I'll use the Majorat Aura and a Calgarian Demon with the Reaver's Ring tests. I won't be using anything extra like Zero-Tick Soulfire or Hydrix Gricko. This is just purely what I'm able to do with the Necromancy weapon itself. So just like the challenge gem tests, this probably isn't a perfectly scientific way to test damage per minute either, but it sounds more fun than challenge gems and it's what I came up with for today's video. So let's use it to get a baseline for the rest of the video. My approach to all of these kills was largely the same. I'll open the fight up with Death Skull, build back up to do a very standard living death. That living death would get me through the first 300,000 HP and start the second phase. After my living death would run out, I would use Split Soul and start improvising with the weapon special attack. So with the Omni Guard, I'm going through that cycle that I mentioned earlier where I'll do auto, necrosis ability, auto, necrosis ability. And the same thing with the Devourer's Guard where I'm planning to do auto, soul ability, auto, soul ability. So here are all of my numbers from the Vindicta tests. And just for good measure, to make sure that I make every good faith attempt, I did also do a challenge gem test as well. So averaging all of these damage per minute numbers together, they're ultimately very similar. I managed on average to do 554,000 damage per minute with the Omni Guard versus 557,000 damage per minute with the Devourer's Guard. The Devourer's Guard performed very slightly better than the Omni Guard in these tests, but that difference is so small that it's not enough to draw any big conclusions about which one is better, realistically. Realistically, they're pretty much on par with each other, which makes sense since they're both weapons of the same tier. So at a baseline, it's going to be more of a side grade rather than an upgrade. That said, let's dive deeper now and look for scenarios where this souls-focused weapon build might really shine in actual gameplay. We are going to get into some specific bosses now, but just so you know what I've been looking for when I've been trying this card, I've been trying to improvise around its strength with the souls. I think it would get a little bit silly if I went to Rasial, for example, and I just copied the current Omni Guard rotation ability for ability. So when I was doing all of my experimenting, I would sometimes start the fight off with the weapon spec, I would sometimes do it in the middle of my living death if I had extra adrenaline, or sometimes I would do it after my living death. Some kills, I wouldn't even living death at all, and I would just experience the slower kill, fully improvising with the Devourer's Guard effects, and I really just wanted to try experimenting with getting as many souls as possible and trying to take advantage of all of those extra souls with extra volleys and extra soul strikes. Ideally, when I'm using Soul Strike, I will be using it with the flanking perk as well. So if you ever see a second Soulbound Lantern in my inventory that is undyed, that's my flanking switch. This Devourer's Guard really does shine with the flanking perk, and flanking is a perk that really shines during group encounters over solo encounters. So I did also try to get in a variety of solo versus group encounters to get as much full spectrum testing in as possible. Starting off with some of the solo bosses. Rasial. The Devourer's Guard doesn't really shine here, no matter what I tried. The boss fight is just so short already that you complete the bulk of the kill in your living death regardless of which weapon you're using, and there's really maybe only 200,000 damage worth of time that you could try and improvise with the guard at the end. That last bit of time is also generally done so quickly that even under the effects of the special attack, you really don't have that much time to get up to an extra volley of souls. So the Omni Guard is definitely better here at Rasial. Even when I started kills off with the Devourer spec, or just outright did the full kill without even using living death, it takes too long to build up any meaningful amount of souls in a short boss fight to speed this up over just using Necrosis and improvising with your Omni Guard. Those empowered autos from the Omni Guard that do double damage definitely prove more valuable here than 2 or 3 extra souls over a quick fight. Sanctum of Rebirth. Pretty similar story here on Vermix. The fight is just too short for this new weapon to really be game-changing. However, when it comes to some of the longer fights, like at Kesselam or Nakatra, which are pretty often around the 3-minute mark, then the extra souls definitely start to be noticeable. With Kesselam, I was getting 3 to 5 more souls per phase than what I'm used to having with an Omni Guard. And since Kesselam is a stunnable boss, I could either hold them basically in place in a stun lock for a while, or wait until the pillars were attackable and dispatch of those pillars extra quick with a big volley of souls. So far as solo content goes, you'll definitely want to use this guard in a more medium to long-term fight, where building up extra souls over time can actually benefit you. At Nakatra, for example, those extra souls prove to be even nicer than at Kesselam. I was always a fan of using the Zorgoth's Ring because I prefer the extra RNG of getting an extra volley over an extra Finger of Death. It's just more satisfying, and if it lines up with you being under Split Soul, it's just better to have an extra volley than an extra finger. So pairing that Zorgoth's Ring with the extra souls from the Devourer's Guard was really cool. There were a number of kills where I could get 3 volley of souls off in phase 2 alone. I would finish off my living death from phase 1, then use the weapon spec and get into a rhythm of doing Soul Reave, Soul Sap, 1 filler ability, Soul Reave, Soul Sap, and Volley, which itself would then ready up my Soul Reave once again, so definitely really promising at slightly longer boss fights like this. The next solo encounter that I tried was Elite Dungeon 2. I thought this would be an interesting one since there are some Threads of Fate opportunities, and since it's one of the easier solo encounters to use flanking at. As far as the Threads of Fate goes, that was awesome. I could use the weapon spec on some of the early monsters, like some of the more lonesome dragons or the lava noodles, and when I would get up to a big cluster of enemies that are just begging to be killed with the Threads of Fate, I would already be under the effects of the weapon spec, and I would be ready to do something like a volley, soul sap volley, then immediately have my Soul Reave ready to build up even more souls, and get yet another volley on some of the upcoming, more lonesome monsters once again. Even the times that I wasn't using Threads of Fate, having all of those extra souls just gave me more area of effect options, where I can just spam Soul Strike over and over and have a 0 adrenaline cost alternative to using Spectral Scythe. Now, I also mentioned flanking, so looking at the bosses, Astelarn was a lot like Rasial, where it's just too short to improvise anything meaningful, regardless of what weapon or combat style you use. Verac is flankable, and it can speed up your kill, but the movement there is a little bit janky. The way he walks is a little bit rubber bandy, so unfortunately the solo flank didn't really shine here that much either. That said, being able to get 1 or 2 extra volley of souls off while under the effects of my split soul was nice. Ultimately though, my kill time was pretty similar with what I would do with an Omni Guard. Now Blackstone Dragon is where that solo flanking really shines through. There are also other solo bosses where you can really benefit from flanking, like Carapac whenever you walk under him, Raksha whenever he's doing the rockfall, or Ambassador anytime that you can step under. But Blackstone Dragon is a more beginner friendly for a first time flanker. Anytime that Blackstone Dragon does the Shadow Enema attack, you're able to surge behind her and get off a couple of flanks. You're able to flank the Black Hands, and you're easily able to flank whenever she's doing the Spiral Flame attack. So it worked out really well with this weapon, almost to the point that it gets utterly silly. I would use the weapon spec, and then the rotation cannot get any simpler after that. Soul Reave auto, flanking Soul Sap. Soul Reave auto, flanking Soul Sap. For the entire duration of the weapon spec, you'd be able to repeat that rotation, and you would do a silly amount of damage for very little effort. That flanking synergy is really going to come through in some of the group encounters that we're about to look at. But for a first look in this solo encounter, with every flanking ability hitting around 14,000 damage, you can start to imagine how having these extra soul stacks will really enhance your damage output. Now the last 2 solo encounters that I wanted to look at are more challenge kills. So I did a solo hard mode Vorago and a solo Angel of Death kill. In the solo AOD kill, it really didn't feel that much better than an Omni Guard, honestly. It felt a little bit better, which I'll touch on, but there's not that many good opportunities to use flanking. You can flank the 2 southern pillars, but that's about it. So overall, the damage output without taking advantage of flanking is quite similar to an Omni Guard. That said, in phase 3, after I cleared out the minions, I did like being able to get more souls and being able to use more volleys. That helped me sustain my hit points a little bit better, since a volley of souls will have better soul split returns than a one-off big hit like a Finger of Death. So overall, it really doesn't blow me away in an encounter like this, but it does have its moments. Once again, it proves to be a very fair side grade. At hard mode Vorago, I really did like it. I did my original 6 out of 6 Golden Defeater challenge with a Zorgoth's Ring, because like I previously mentioned, I just enjoy the extra volley more than I do an extra finger here and there. Without considering the weapon, I'm sure that a Zorgoth and an Occultist Ring provide very similar damage, but I often go with the one that's more fun. And for me, that's always been the Zorgoth. So comboing that with the Devourer's Guard was awesome. I could improvise really well in a lot of the damage check phases like phase 1 and the weekly special phases. I actually did my personal best phase 1 even without using Living Death, and just by using the weapon spec with an extra volley of souls. It wasn't dramatically faster, but it was a few seconds faster than my previous best, so that was cool to see. The same story with some of my weekly special phases. I didn't even really need to use Living Death in any of them to still do good damage. I could use Split Soul, Devourer spec, and improvise around building souls that would let me get off 2 big volleys. On phases 10 and 11, truthfully, I think the Omni Guard would have been a better option. Those bigger Necrosis hits are probably more impactful to getting good push against Vorago, but I was still very successful with employing the strategy of this weapon spec and trying to get off 2 to 3 big juicy volleys off. One strategy that came to mind while doing this was to even use the Split Soul incantation on phases 10 and 11. Now normally that doesn't actually contribute to your push against Vorago. However, it does contribute to getting Vorago's hit points lower, and the only reason that that's useful is to reach the threshold to activate Deathmark. Deathmark gives you good push, so anything that synergizes well with Split Soul can be an effective strategy there. All in all though, the Devourer's Guard didn't really blow me away once again in either of these big solo encounters. It was perfectly serviceable, but it didn't feel any better or any worse than an Omni Guard. It wasn't really such a radical change like going from a tier 90 weapon up to a tier 95, or even a weapon of the same tier, where a Langsword might have a dramatically different playstyle than an Exekill. So far in the solo encounters, these 2 Necromancy playhands play reasonably similarly to each other. So with all that said, let's start looking at a couple of group encounters. And first up, I went to 7-man Angel of Death. So long as I'm not the base tank player, I can basically stand behind the boss for the entire duration of the fight, which means that I'll be able to flank the boss all day long. And flanking seems to be this weapon's one true calling. The rotation you can do is just completely silly, and it outputs great damage. Weapon spec, auto flank, auto flank. It really can't get any simpler than that. And with every flanking ability hitting 14,000 damage on average, I'm able to just completely shred the boss in the first phase, spam a ton of flankings, and still build back up to full soul stacks for a big volley when it comes time for the minion lure. Now typically with an Omni Guard rotation, you'll get one flanking, and then you spend the rest of the phase 1 building back up to full soul stacks. But with the Devourer's Guard, I'm able to omit some of those weaker basic abilities in the rotation in favor for some more flankings and soul reaves, which will still keep me on pace with the rest of the team when it comes to building up those soul stacks. I also did like this special attack on the pillars. Sometimes outside of a living death with necromancy, you can find yourself feeling in a bit of an awkward dead space with your good abilities. Like your living death and your death skulls might be on cooldown for a really long time, and it feels like you're just forced to spam auto attacks until something more powerful is available again. But with this weapon spec, I'm able to spam flankings and even volley of souls, so in that respect it feels a little bit more flexible than an Omni Guard. Depending on how you manage your necrosis ability cooldowns, even an Omni Guard can fall into that similar awkward feeling dead space where you're trying to take advantage of these empowered auto attacks, but the cooldowns on your necrosis abilities like Death Skulls or Touch of Death is just too long, and maybe you don't want to spend all of your adrenaline on a Finger of Death just to get another empowered auto attack. But you really never run into that issue with the Devourer's Guard. Soul Sap, Soul Strike, and Spectral Scythe are basically almost always going to be available for you to improvise with in order to get more Soul Reave auto attacks. And worst case scenario, if you find yourself having to use a Spectral Scythe in order to get a Soul Reave auto, that's only going to cost you 10% adrenaline instead of a potential 60% adrenaline if you wanted to get a Desperation Finger into an Omni Guard auto. Next up, let's look at Amascut, where the guard comes from in the first place. And I'll tell you that this guard is really awesome here. At Amascut, this 100% outperforms the Omni Guard. And again, it all comes down to that one flanking ability. At Amascut, you just have so many opportunities over such a lengthy boss fight to use flanking that it just becomes dominant here as a Necromancer. It's been pretty rare that I'm not the base tank at Amascut, so excuse my gameplay and positioning in some of these clips here, but I did have a lot of fun using the Devourer's Guard in the few hours that I got to be a Necromancer here at Amascut. Basically, any time that I'm not in my living death, I'm improvising with this guard, and even improvising is too big of a word, because it's really nothing fancy. I'll try and use Split Soul whenever Amascut is downed. I'll weapon spec, auto flank over and over and over again. Of course, I'll still want to use things like Bloat and Death Skulls if they're available to me, but like I've said time and time again in this video, this weapon really brings the heat for the flanking ability. It's borderline ridiculous how often you can spam it, and how much of your rotation starts to revolve around flanking with this guard. Not only can you flank the actual Amascut boss herself, but all of the chains whenever you go inside the portal rooms are all flankable as well, so you can kill those in just a few abilities, even at high enrages. Even putting flanking aside for a moment, Amascut also gives this weapon the chance to shine because there are quite a few opportunities to use Threads of Fate effectively. Basically, any time that Amascut goes downed, there'll often be a handful of extra feline ox to use Threads of Fate on, or of course the Shadow Clones in Phase 6. And since the damage from your initial hit of your weapon spec is empowered by the number of soul stacks you have, if somehow you don't already have enough soul stacks from the passive effect, you can nearly instantly get up to 5 souls and just about guarantee yourself a 30k hit by using the weapon spec, plus still have time for one more ability in your threads. So a potential example rotation there could be something like Threads of Fate, Soul Sap to get you up to 5 stacks, Weapon Spec for a 30k, and if the targets around you still somehow manage to live, you could use that Soul Reave auto attack with the last ability of your Threads of Fate, which like I said is going to act like a Soul Sap and get you right back up to full souls once again. From that point, you could then improvise with the Weapon Spec by doing something like Volley, Auto Flank, Auto Flank, Auto Flank. So there are going to be some interesting rotations that come from this weapon, particularly at group encounters, places you can flank, and places where you can take advantage of Threads of Fate. So just to summarize my overall thoughts on the weapon, this is very much a side grade weapon. It is not a game-changing upgrade like going from a Noxious Staff to a Fractured Staff of Armadyl. It does, however, have some interesting niches that can make it situationally better to camp over an Omni Guard, most notably in group encounters, where you can use the weapon special attack to then spam Soul Strike with the flanking perk. If you're just looking for which of these two Necromancy main hands to buy, to simplify my recommendation, I would say that if you're predominantly a solo player who does a lot of solo bosses, an Omni Guard is still going to be your go-to. If you are someone who's looking to get more into group bosses, then I'll recommend that you go with the Devourers Guard. As the true meta for this weapon continues to develop, I do think that it will be reasonably likely that we see some rotations where we'll want to bring both Necromancy weapons with us. We'll probably use the Omni Guard special attack and passive effect either before and during our Living Death, and then use the Devourer's Guard special and passive outside of Living Death once Necrosis becomes less abundant and we can rely more heavily on souls. So that is going to be the next playstyle that I'm going to experiment with going forward. It is a bit out of scope for what I had time to do with this video today, but if you are interested in a follow-up video with a quote-unquote hybrid necromancy playstyle using both weapons, then let me know. For now, I enjoyed my time camping each weapon individually and starting to get some senses of the strengths and weaknesses of the Devourer's Guard. Overall, I thought it was a really cool weapon. I look forward to using it more in group content, and I hope that this video was informative and entertaining. If it was, please be sure to subscribe to my channel, share this video with a friend, and let me know if you'll be picking up the Devourer's Guard for yourself. Thanks for watching, and see you soon.